Hello, my name is Riley, and this is Amanda, and this is On the Way Up Leadership Interview Series. Hi, Amanda. You want to introduce yourself just for the viewers?
Sure. I'm Amanda Irions, and I am an assistant professor of strategic communication here at Doane.
Awesome. So the entire idea of the leadership series is picking the brains of just some of our key leaders around campus, maybe in front of the spotlight or behind the spotlight. So just starting off with the leadership idea, what is leadership to you?
I know you sent me the questions before we had this meeting, and I've really been thinking about what leadership is to me, and I'm afraid I don't have a particularly good answer. I've studied leadership, in graduate school. I've taken organizational psychology classes, organizational psych classes, so I can give you like textbook definitions, and we can talk about theories of leadership, right? But I think for me, what it boils down to is helping people recognize what they can uniquely contribute to a group, and then helping them understand that they have the ability to effect something about the group, that they can bring those abilities and skills to bear.
Yeah, that's awesome. You mentioned that you are an assistant professor of strategic communications. So what is communications? What does it do with you being a leadership? Is there a role in communications in you being a leadership?
So communication, just very generally, is the study of messages, right? And when we study messages, we can't just study messages. We have to study the context. So we also need to study the person who sends the message and the person who receives the message. We have to study the environment they're in, the channel through which the message is sent, and all of the sorts of thoughts and emotions and behaviors that go into the message, and all of the thoughts and emotions and behaviors that the message creates, right? So we really look at everything. And with respect to leadership, communication is how leadership happens. Leadership is enacted through messages, in one-on-one conversations, near a microwave at lunch, on a walk around campus, or sometimes when we think of leadership, we think of like one person making a speech to many people. And really those types of leadership communication situations are much rarer than the one-on-one or a group or a small team. So understanding how communication works really enables people to do leadership better.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome explanation of what communications is and how it plays into leadership. So the month is February. It's Black History Month, and On the Way Up has kind of taken upon us to make sure that that has been voiced around campus. As far as that goes, what do you think it means to be a leader of color here on campus? Is there an importance to be a leader of color here on campus?
So I guess that I don't really think of myself as a leader on campus, right? Like I'm just a lady who goes about, like I have a to-do list, and then like I check things off, and like that's how it works, right? And I understand, as I'm sure you understand as someone who studies leadership, that there's a difference between functional leadership and leadership by fiat, or leadership because of one's title, right? So I know that I have some formal organizational leadership roles, right? Such as like I'm the chairperson of the Undergraduate Academic Affairs Committee this year, right? That is the formal leadership role I have, but I don't think of it as anything more than the person who puts the agenda together with Missy Persing, right? And who communicates among the people submitting proposals and the faculty assembly. I mean, it's really just I see myself in more of a communication hub that way than a leader. But I think that being a leader and being a minority, right, I think is an important thing to talk about, because, and this is going to require some social scientific theory, right, to understand where I'm coming from. So we're gonna have to explain that first a little bit. And in the late 1970s, early 1980s, there were these two researchers who were Tajfel and Turner, right? They did a lot of work together, and they were really interested in questions of groups and group membership. And how do I know which group I belong to? How do you know which groups I belong to? How do I know which groups you belong to? And so from their thinking, we get two related theories. One is self-categorization theory, which explains sort of how I know what groups I'm a member of. And the other one is social identity theory, which talks about once I've identified a social membership that I have, what does that do for my interactions with other people who have that same membership? And crucially, what does that mean for how I, as a group member, interact with people who don't have that group membership, right? So you're wearing a Doane football hat. I'm going to assume that you have something to do with Doane football. Is that fair?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. What do you have to do with Doane football?
I played 2 years of collegiate football, and then I decided it'd probably be in my best interest to not continue playing, but I love the hat, and I'm going to be completely honest with you. I'm having a bad hair day.
Understandable, right?
Yeah.
So you, and wearing that hat, signaled that you were or are a member of Doane football, right? I am not, right?
Yeah.
First of all, I'm not, I don't play football. I don't have the skills for any of the positions, right? But second, I am not eligible to play football for Doane, right? So for those two reasons, we are members of different groups. Your in-group is Doane football. And because I am not in Doane football, I'm in an out-group, right? And that is one example of a social identity or a membership in a group that we have, right? And so everyone has multiple social identities. Everyone belongs to a bunch of different groups. Not all of the group memberships are all relevant all at the same time, but when they are, they are. And so when it comes to thinking about leaders of color in a space, right? Typically we think about of color meaning something to do with race or something to do with ethnicity, right? And specifically, we define of color as not white, even though white folks have a color and white folks have a race, right? So already that phrase of color separates what kind of leaders are on campus and separates, well, I shouldn't say separates, but frames how we think about leaders already, just in the question, right? And so when we think about what is important to know about being a leader of color on campus, it is that most of our theories of leadership don't take group membership into account. They don't take how the world views me or how the world views you into account, right? A lot of theories of leadership say, well, if you are an authentic leader and you do these things, you, right? Or if you're a transformational leader and you do this other list of things, like then you'll really do leadership well, right? But that leadership operates in a context. That leadership operates in the context of who is doing these things. And that leadership operates in the context of what group is this leadership happening in, right? And so when you ask about leadership and, anyone of any minority status, but particularly people of color on the Doane campus, it is not as simple as saying, oh, well, I took a leadership course for a week and I have a certificate and I know how to do this stuff, right? And I got an A+ in negotiation, right? Because the leadership, those theories of leadership really reflect and are responsive to people who have group memberships that put them in positions of social power, right? And so when you think about what does leadership look like for someone who very visibly does not have those same sorts of genotypic phenotypes that put me in some of the more powerful social groups, right? That means that I can't really take any of that for granted, right? Because it really, not just on campus, but sort of everywhere in my experience and then in my observation, when a person of color is doing leadership or is in a position of leadership, there's always an implied, you serve at the pleasure of, like you serve at the pleasure of the president, you serve as long as we let you.
Exactly. Yeah.
right? And so that that always is sort of in the back of the mind is, okay, how do I navigate, working on a to-do list, or really encouraging people and empowering them, or even shaping what sorts of goals I think are able to be pursued in a given context, right? Are all shaped by, if I don't do this well, or if I, say the wrong thing to the wrong person, not only is that it for me, they are then going to say, okay, well, that's it. It's it for everyone who looks like her.
Yeah.
We tried that once 20 years
Yeah.
ago. It didn't work out for us very well. And so there's, in the intergroup, the social identity theory literature and the self-categorization theory literature, right? It speaks a lot to what does it mean to have that sort of tenuous position where you are trying to do things, but so you're trying to do things,
Mhm.
and the things you're trying to do are the things that other people have asked you to do, right? Like that's why you're doing these things. But how do you accomplish those goals in such a way that those other people don't feel threatened because it comes from someone who looks like me instead of someone from their in groups who looks like you, right? And so on the one hand, if I do the things I was asked or hired to do, and people don't like it and they get threatened, then I'm done for, right? But if I respect and sort of like keep people feeling comfortable, then I might not get done everything that I was hired to do. And then I'm also done for, right? And that, I think, is a tension that a lot of the leadership literature just doesn't take into account or is responsive to.
That's beautiful. The deconstruction of that, as far as how our social groups view other people that are just specifically look different than us.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I I just have such a hard time seeing people ascend into leadership, and then just like you state, just because of who you just are so viewed upon in a negative way, or might have ideas in the back of their head that, oh, I don't know if this person's going to perform as well. I
Mhm.
think you perfectly put it as far as how difficult that is.
Mhm.
Steer it back into leadership a little bit. Um, when would you consider the beginning of your leadership journey, if you would consider it a journey? I know that's a super open and kind of cheesy
Yeah.
question, but when you were like, I think this is something that I need to be into?
Well, it's, again, like I said, I don't really think of myself as a leader. So I guess I don't really think of myself as having a journey into leadership. And I don't really think I have a starting point, right? Like I I think that I recognized that there was something. I think I recognized that I was the kind of person who likes to get things done, right? Pretty early on. Like that was not a surprise to me or my parents. So I recognized that pretty early on. And as a result of that, when I was a kid, and I was like, oh, well, hey, like maybe we could do this or maybe we could do that. It was always, okay, come on, like settle down. You're 8 years old. Don't tell us, like what we need to cook for supper this week. Like maybe we could just handle it as the adults, right? So that was part of it. And from that sort of like childhood onward, I thought it was really interesting to observe what it was that made it okay for people to accept hearing somebody else's perspective and then even do what the other person is suggesting, right? And so I think that it has really been, throughout my life, if we're going to think about it as a journey, it's really been um, a the more I learn about people, through science, through research, through teaching, the more I learn about when people can be open enough to hear something, right? And that really is when they're feeling safe, when they're feeling comfortable, when they're feeling secure is when people are really able to be open and to hear things. And then it's really about, okay, now that they've heard it, like, how do we get them to really believe that they can go do it? And so um, I've also been interested, because like they're two different things. Like, just because you hear something doesn't mean you think, oh, I automatically have a bunch of self-efficacy, I can go do it now, right? So that other piece of how do we translate what they've heard into self-efficacy and into action is something that I've also been interested in. And studying communication, studying psychology has really been helpful in sort of framing that study and then also beginning to get some answers.
Yeah, it piqued my interest. It's very, very interesting to think about these big philosophical questions. Um, as far as we talk about application in the leadership realm, and maybe you don't consider yourself a leader, but what advice would you give to someone young who is struggling with either trying to find their identity or struggling with identity, even an 18-year-old here in Crete that showed up on campus? Is there anything that you found through your journey that would be influential for someone of that age?
One of the things I love about teaching is that I get to work with a lot of young people who have such new and wonderful ways of looking at the world that never would have occurred to people my age and older, right? Like, that's one of the real joys of teaching, is I get to hear this all day, every day. And so when you ask me, what advice do I have to give to young folks who are sort of struggling with identity, I would just say, and this may not be helpful, but it matters more and it matters less than you think it does, right? Like, as we talked about earlier with social identity theory and self-categorization theory, right? Identity does matter, because that is how you see yourself, and how you see yourself affects how you behave, affects what you think is possible for you, affects what you think isn't possible for you, affects how other people treat you, right? So identity is really important. But on the other hand, identity is not important at all, because it ultimately comes down to, are you good with what you've done? And if you're good with what you've done, then what else really matters? And there are ways of looking at identity as, okay, well, by for example, my tattoos, right? I have this identity. Or by my kind of hair, I have this identity. Or by wearing glasses, we now have the same kind of identity, right? And therefore, because of XYZ identity, therefore I should ABC, right? And that's not really how I approach the world, right? I think, okay, what needs to be done right now, right? What is the thing that needs to happen in order for everything else to happen? And for me, identity doesn't really come into it a lot, right? Just because I think, okay, what needs to happen? What can I do to help that happen? And then, that's it. So I think that one thing that sometimes can be forgotten in the identity fluctuation period, right, is one, that there is an identity fluctuation period. It's called your life, right? So it sometimes becomes more settled and more in flux as you go through life, right? So identities will change. The importance to you of identities will change, of yours and other people's. So prepare yourself for that, and prepare for things to be stable. Like, it fluctuates. And two, I think that some people think that, especially when you're like really in the middle of it, identity is forever, and it just isn't. And if you don't like something, then you have the power to change it. Let me clarify. I know there are skin bleaching creams. I know that there are hair straightening chemicals, right? But that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about like the surface level stuff. I'm talking about if I have, looked at the patterns of my life during, for example, this pandemic, hey, Kat, and I am like, I have not read enough. I can take behavior tonight. I can do something to do more reading, right? And in that way, it's helpful to remember that part of identity comes from observing what we do and then inferring what that means about what our commitments and values and priorities are, right? So if I notice myself doing more reading, I think, oh, I'm a reader, right? So you can change identities that you're not happy with. And it's an experiment. If you change it and you don't like it and you want to go back to the way it was, great. I just stop reading more, right? I go back to reading the amount I was reading before and I'm good.
Yeah, that I think that is very well put as far as just the idea of approach to behavior and behavior change. And um, I always joke as far as like I'm in the classroom now doing my practicum experience, and
Mm.
first question is I was just like, how's college? I'm just like, I am a different individual than who I was 4 years ago standing in
Yep.
y'all's feeds. It's just this entire, I mean, what knowledge can do to you in 4 years. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I would very much consider you an accomplished individual, and we kind of touched on inspiring those who are struggling. Was there a point in your stride to get where you're at now where you really hit rock bottom? And then to answer that, how did you rebound from that low point?
This is not going to be a happy discussion, but I mean, it's sort of for me an everyday thing, right? Like every day I'm like, okay, I still have this to-do list, right?
Yeah.
How do I make it happen today? Like, do I still have the skills or the knowledge or the good luck or the right network to accomplish these things, right? And for me, it is every day that I have to think, oh God, can I do it? You know, it truly every day, you
Absolutely. Yeah.
know? And so I think for me, the two things that really helped were one, understanding that I I I don't have to get everything done, right? I the to-do list will still be there tomorrow, right? I can still work tomorrow. So going to bed with a to-do list is not a catastrophe. It is just a reason for getting up tomorrow, right? And I think the second thing that really helped um, was that instead of thinking, oh God, how do I do this again? It becomes a game of, hey, like, how can I do it differently this time? Like, how could I do it using skills that I maybe am feeling shaky about and don't have very much confidence in? Or how do I, work in skills that or knowledge that I had from 10 years ago, right? And bring that to bear because I haven't worked with that particular idea in a while. Or, if I could do this in the way that like my 8-year-old self would think like, oh, that's a really great way to do it. Like, what does it look like that way? And so turning it into a game, turning it into an experiment, like I'm a tinkerer at heart, like that's why I'm a scientist. But I found that turning it into a game of seeing what is possible today um, also takes a lot of the pressure off of, oh God, I didn't get it all done. Or, oh God, I didn't get it done as well as I wanted it to.
Yeah. Uh, I think it's really important, especially during this lovely pandemic, that kind of your day by day formula is implemented for a lot of people. I know I certainly feel that way. Um, let's pick it back up a little bit. On the contrast of that, was there a time where you were hitting full stride in your undergrad or your graduate program where you're just like, things are clicking for me? And can you attribute that success to anything particular you were doing as an individual?
Again, I don't really think I've ever felt like I've been at full stride, right? Like I think that I have definitely had the sense of, oh, I got real lucky that I happened to remember this thing, right? And I I paused because like, how occasionally like the people you're close to, like you can sometimes hear their voices in your head, right? So like that just happened and they were all saying, no, 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 you didn't just get lucky, right? and I think if I'm going to respond to like that, like, yeah, I bust my ass. Like I
Absolutely.
work,
Yeah.
and I prepare and I I care a lot about learning and learning things that I am not ordinarily drawn to, and learning things that, aren't particularly well known, and learning things that are, that offer commentaries and different perspectives about what we think we know, right? So I really do think it's important that to keep reading and to keep expanding your perspective and to listen to other people, right? That is the only way that, if I'm writing a paper and I'm like, oh, I could work that in, right? Or if I'm teaching, I'm like, oh yeah, we could totally talk about that. And like, one of the great things, speaking of the pandemic, is that like teaching from Zoom has the distinct benefit of like, if I'm like, oh God, I read this book, I can just go and take it off my shelf and like pull it open, right? But the only reason that I've been able to get to, to hit a stride or to get lucky is because I have been prepared, and just because something doesn't seem relevant or worthwhile, because I mean, I teach gen ed classes.
Yeah.
Do I confront when am I ever going to use this regularly? Yes, of course I do, right? And the answer is that that's not the point of education, right? Education, the benefit of education is not transactional. The benefit of education is that you are exposed to a variety of thinking about a variety of subjects. And when you need one of those things, you can go back to it. And if you don't even give yourself the foundation, what do you have? Nothing, right?
Nothing.
So those are the two things I think about, like when I hit full stride, right? Like, one, honestly, I haven't hit full stride. I think I'm just occasionally lucky, right?
Yeah.
But two, and more important, I only get lucky because I have put a lot of work in to prepare myself for that luck to happen.
Right place, right time, but many hours behind the desk. Yeah.
Yep. It looks like a half a minute, but no, it's actually 10 years.
Yeah, it was there. Just to bring it a little bit back into leadership, who is someone who you consider a personal leader? Marilyn Johnson Farr took this quite literally, and she thought someone on campus. I was like, no, Marilyn, it doesn't have to be on campus. Is there someone you consider a personal leader?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were going to say a little bit more.
Sorry about that.
Okay. I think, so one of my grandmothers recently died, as you know, right? And I think that being as old as I am, and I'm almost 40, and having a grandparent die, speaking of identities, right? It is a different experience than when you are, not necessarily you, but like, when I'm 20 or when I'm 8, because you've done more living, you have a deeper appreciation for what life means. Mm-hmm. And you have a deeper appreciation for what, not just the relationship that you have with that person that is, now gone, but also what that is linked to, right? Because it's not like this grandmother, right? It's not just, oh, I'm missing my grandmother. Now it's, oh, who else has a memory in the family of this particular time in history, right? Like when a particular company was formed, or when, like Johnny Carson was an undergraduate, right? So it takes on a different meaning. And I think that I have a new respect and a new appreciation for my grandparents as leaders, because I look at them. One of them was a Presbyterian minister, and it was only like the year before he died that I learned that he never actually graduated from seminaries. Like I was like, wait, I just assumed, right? And he said no. My school decided they didn't like some of my views, and so they said, hey, thanks for being here for 2.5 years. You're not going to graduate. I know.
Wow.
I know, which is also a great lesson about how not to be in education, right? Yeah. So like, first of all, apparently the entire seminary was convened, and there was this like 8-hour oral argument, and they voted, some voted against, some voted for, but enough voted for that he passed through, right? And so like I think that I've learned a lot about leadership because he was both in a formal leader and then an informal leader. He was a pastor of a church, right? I think of a grandmother, and I sort of lovingly refer to my grandmothers as my Axis grandmothers because one emigrated from Italy and one emigrated from Germany, right?
Nice.
Right. And so my German Axis grandmother, she had after she died, we learned about this whole other life she had before she came to the United States. And we learned that she had kids and that she was apparently this society woman who had the bad fortune of being married to a businessman who thought that he could secure business by joining the Nazi party and really supporting those ideals. And Grandma Margaret said, I can't do that. I can't, I won't. And I need to go and I'm taking the kids. And this of course was in like 1941 in Germany, right? And so her husband said, listen, you got two choices. You can leave and leave the kids with me and I'll make sure no one comes after you. Or you can take the kids and you take your chances, right? And so God bless her, what a terrible position to be in. She left the kids because she wanted to make sure, she thought, well, at least they'll live. And then she emigrated to the United States and started a new family, a new life, So I think about a lot of the wisdom that we sometimes overlook in the people we know because we have a familial relationship with them. Right. And so going back to what I said earlier about like really listening and really trying to understand what it is that people experienced and how it is they see the world is not just something that like we should do with strangers, but like we should also do with people in our own families. And so I'm not sure that that's necessarily the one leader you were asking for. And I think also because her death is so fresh, like that, this is just something I've been thinking about. But I really do think that we can learn a lot from leadership from a lot of the people in our lives if we stop and take the time to ask them and to really, really listen. And then also to think about what their lessons mean outside of the familial relationship and what, how we can begin to do that.
That was beautiful. I mean, that's very interesting. Access grandmothers, give me a chuckle. As far as highlighting people on campus, I also like to highlight goals that individuals have on campus. Do you have any goals that you are working towards that you would like the campus or the people to know about in general?
Yeah. Yes. Several. And we can start from like more concrete to more abstract, right? Yeah. My first very concrete goal is I'd like to get like a garden going. There's a lot of green space on campus. And I keep thinking, y'all, we could be using this to help support the ecosystem. We could be using this to give faculty and staff and students gardening space. So you could have some vegetables to rely on, right? We could also, wouldn't it be fantastic to have a Doane community garden and give fresh produce to some of the food networks in Crete? Like, come on, for me, that's a no-brainer. And I will say that Blake Colclasher has been very nice in listening to me. And if we could, join forces with your audience and my own big mouth, Blake is in and we can start this. But to move sort of to more abstract goals and perhaps more important goals, one of the things that is really important for me right now is working to decrease the anxiety and begin to work on healing the campus. This interview is happening the semester after prioritization, 3 semesters into a pandemic. Mm-hmm. And it really was shocking to me how little caring and empathy there seemed to be for students in particular, right? Staff and faculty, yes, also, right? But students really bore the brunt of it, really continue to bear the brunt of it. And what makes it really difficult for me to watch is that students have the least power in all of this, you know. And I have a lot of empathy for what you students, Jesus, must have been, but also continue to experience, right? And I know that it can sometimes be confusing for students to look at what's happening between faculty and administration and think, well, what the hell, just get it together. I'm paying you money. I'm here for an education. Like, what's hard about this, right? Like, I get it. I think the same thing too sometimes, right? But I also think that, when we were talking earlier about um, learning from people outside of the context of our relationship with them, the same thing is true here, right? Because students see faculty and administrators in the context of that student, faculty relationship. And I think that sometimes students forget that faculty are humans. We have interests and needs and desires outside of grading. We sure do, right? And it is for a fact, and this is certainly not me saying, oh, we need more sadness for faculty, because there's a lot of sadness for faculty, but also I'm saying, let's think about the students, but to sort of explain the other perspective to students, right? The other side of that is that faculty have you know, this is what we want to do. This is who we are. And so in the prioritization process, some of the things that have happened have left the faculty with the impression that not only do their jobs not matter, who they are as people doesn't matter. And that is a really awful feeling to have, right? And so I'm saying all this to say that one of my first big goals, abstract, for this campus is to really get people healing. And I mean, I know that this is your first time meeting me, but those who know me know that I'm not like a touchy feely kind of person. Like, I'm not the person you go to for like a hug if you're sad. Like, that's not me, right?
No,
So right. So the fact that I'm saying we need more healing and empathy and trust on this campus is a big deal, because we can't do anything else if students live with the constant anxiety of, okay, prioritization is done now, but what about 2 years from now? Is this a stable environment, right? Can I get a good education given that so many faculty themselves are anxious and worried and scared and sad, right? Can I trust that Doane will be able to recruit new talent to replace the people who have left, right? And so I really do think that well, speaking of leadership, I really do hope that the new president really takes an active interest in working to bring the campus back together, because that is the foundation for any sort of success that president will have.
Yes, it's definitely something that personal roles in leadership here on campus is we've just kind of chucked this last 3 semesters up to this weird limbo where
Yeah.
COVID for students and prioritization for faculty. Travis Handler, who is the sitting president chair for H-Lab, LPS major, and just kind of working with him last semester, just kind of talking through things and just the uncertainty of everything. And then like both just kind of looking at each other and just be like, we just have to be okay with this. And then I think definitely what you're saying as far as leadership and administration, it's okay. It's COVID. It's hard to get your faces in front of us, but there's definitely been a lack of, hey, how are you? I think that Myron and Crystal left last week. That was unfortunate, but Myron and them over at that office have done just an amazing job of just constantly establishing like, hey, here we are. Come use us, please. I think that's an awesome goal. I personally feel that way. I know a lot of leadership in the education department feels that way. I mean, I sit down with callback and in Maryland, and I feel like that's all we talk about is trying to get this campus back up to
Yeah.
a semblance of what it used to be, at least.
Can I just say, I mean, just briefly, I hear that a lot, not just with what's happening at Doane, but also what's happening with the pandemic. Oh, I just can't wait for things to get back to normal. Oh, I can't just, and I keep thinking, but going back to normal means that we have the same structural and human problems that brought us to this point in the first place. So for myself, I'm not particularly interested in going back to some other place in history, because if we do that, we come to the same point here. What I think for me is more useful is to think about what led us to where we are, and to really sit down and analyze that. And it's very easy to say, oh, well, you did this and you did that, right? And entirely ignoring what it is we did to contribute to that, right? But I think it's a necessary process, because it is only through really understanding what happened and taking responsibility for your part in it that you can begin to move forward in a better way, right? So I understand that sometimes when people say, I just want things to go back to normal, what they really mean is, I'm terrified and I just want to go back to a time where I'm not terrified and I don't have anxiety all the time, and I can just hug people and know that it's going to be safe for me and for the other person, and I can just trust that I'm going to have a major tomorrow. Like, I understand that some of what that is, or some of what that means, is I want certainty, right? But it is important for me to say, okay, I think certainty, stability, reliability, I understand why those are attractive, but the same kind of reliability, like the same kind of thing that exists reliably, but that is a problem and that is known to cause problems, and that we see the evidence of causing problems right here in front of us, that's not a thing I want to go back to. That is not because then we are committing the errors in full knowledge that they are errors, right? Whereas before, people could maybe make the tiniest claim, oh, I didn't know. Okay, well, now we know. Right? And so now we are choosing to do the same things that brought us to a bad place the first time. And for my money, if I can avoid a mistake, I'm going to.
Yes. Yeah. I think one thing that everything has brought us is a sense of uncomfortability. And one thing that I've really latched on in the past couple of years is being uncomfortable brings change. You're forced to adjust to it.
Necessary.
Yes. And I think that will be evident when whoever steps into these presidential shoes is going to see that this campus is in dire need of change, as far as across the board, laterally, vertically. Look forward to that. I don't know. I'm only gonna have 1 year of the presidency, but I'd love to leave Doane in a better place than what we came into, what we're transitioning to. As we bring this interview to end, I like to ask everybody that I interview if they have a life motto, or a motto that they kind of live by in their day by day that they really come back to at the end of the day. Do you have one of those, or is that another abstract idea?
No, so I don't have like a motto, right? Although I like those, like the people who know us and love us very well, right? I can hear some people saying, no, I've heard you say several things that sounded awful, but I don't think that I do. A motto. I think that's something that I really work to remember, is that you can feel anxiety and you can feel fear and then still do the thing that makes you afraid, right? Like a a fear or an anxiety is not in and of itself a barrier to action, even though it really, really feels like one when you feel it, right? But recognizing that there is a difference between feeling fear and feeling anxiety on the one hand, and my ability to do the thing anyway on the other hand, I think has been important, because it really was much more helpful for me to think, oh, okay, great. So I recognize that I'm feeling fear and I can still do this thing, right? And it is only when you begin to accumulate the experience of yourself as someone who can push through fear that, to get back to one of your earlier questions, helps build for yourself the identity of someone who can push through fear. But if you feel fear or if you feel anxiety and you're like, I can't, right? Then you only have a picture of yourself as someone who can't do things. And that's not helpful, right? So I think, again, to go back to one of the other things I was saying earlier, right? Like, I'm a tinkerer, I'm an experimenter. That's why I love science so much. And so for me, it was important to think about science and like basic principles of science, to think about, okay, I can experiment with this. I'm feeling afraid, I'm feeling anxious. What if I just went ahead and tried it anyway? Like, what's the worst that can happen? It doesn't work? Great. Now I know, and I can take another approach. So I think that would be something that I try to remember.
Beautiful. I mean, I certainly enjoyed it. I've always hearing words of wisdom from different people, how they function. Thank you, Amanda, for doing this. I know you and I kind of played, ping pong back and forth, trying to get a time figured out, but I'm glad it worked out. This was lovely. Again, I'm Riley, this is Amanda, and this is On the Way Up interview, Hands on Leadership interview series.